Alexander, a business travel manager, often stayed in cheap hotels. This time he had to spend the night in a small town lost on the map. The only available room he found was in an old hotel with a peeling sign that read Hotel North. The receptionist, an older woman with empty eyes and an unnatural smile, handed him a key with a faded 13 sign. "We don't have many guests," she said quietly. "You'll be safe in this room." Room 13 was on the 3rd floor, at the end of a dark corridor. The light bulbs were barely lit and the floor creaked underfoot. Alexander felt uncomfortable, but put it down to fatigue. When he opened the door, he saw an old, shabby room, a bed with a shabby bedspread, a closet that seemed to hide secrets, and a mirror hung too low. Despite the furnishings, the room was clean. "I'll make it through one night," Alexander muttered, throwing his bag on the bed. As he sat down at his desk to open his laptop, there was a sound. First a quiet whisper, like the wind outside the window, then something that sounded like knocking. Alexander froze, listening. The source of the sound was in the closet. Mice. He reassured himself and walked over to the closet. Opening it, he found it empty, but on the inside of the door was engraved a strange phrase, "Don't look in the mirror at night." Chuckling, Alexander closed the closet and decided to ignore the silly superstition. The night was quiet until 3 o'clock in the morning. At that time, Alexander woke up to a loud creaking sound. He slowly opened his eyes and saw that the mirror in the room was skewed, though he was sure it was hanging straight. From the depths of the mirrored surface, something stared back at him that words could not describe. The creature was not a shadow, not human, but something completely alien. He froze, trying to convince himself it was a dream, but the creature began to move. Its reflection began to emerge from the mirror. Alexander, clutching at the bedspread, could neither scream nor move, and at that moment, a quiet voice sounded. "You have looked. Now you are a guest." The light went out. The room was in total darkness. When the light suddenly returned, Alexander was not in his room. Everything had changed. The walls were cracked, the furniture looked decayed, and the air was damp and musty. However, the mirror was still hanging on the wall, its surface now covered with cracks, as if someone had tried to escape from inside. "What's going on?" Alexander whispered, trying to realize where he was. He went to the door, but it wouldn't budge. The lock was as cold as ice, and it was as if it was jammed shut. Alexander turned around, and his gaze fell on the mirror again. Now he noticed that his reflection did not follow his movements. "It's impossible," he muttered, backing away. In the reflection, Alexander saw himself, but his copy was behaving strangely, smiled, looked at him with a predatory look, and slowly raised his hand, pointing at the closet. The closet, which had looked old and dusty earlier, was now ajar, and from its depths a barely discernible light stretched. Alexander's heart pounded faster, but he felt he had no choice. He needed to find out what was going on. As he approached the closet, he noticed that there were no familiar shelves inside. Instead, the closet had a gaping passage going into endless darkness. Suddenly, he heard a voice coming from there. "Go, or you'll stay here forever." The voice was female, but it sounded as if a dozen people were speaking at once. Alexander tried to resist, but an unknown force seemed to pull him inside. Taking a deep breath, he stepped into the closet. Inside, he found himself in a long, narrow corridor, lit by a faint, flickering light. The walls of the hallway were covered with mirrors, but there was no reflection of him in them. Instead, scenes flashed in each mirror, people screaming in fear, some trying to escape, others crying as if asking for help. "What is this?" he asked, feeling the fear gripping him with renewed vigor. "They are the ones before you," came a voice behind him. Alexander turned around and saw the figure. It was a woman in a white dress, with empty eye sockets and dead pale skin. "Who are you?" he asked, stepping back. "I am one of those who stayed here. This place is a trap for those who look where they shouldn't. You were given a chance to leave, but you had already made your choice when you opened the closet door." "I didn't mean to adjust." Alexander started to justify himself, but the woman interrupted him. "You're a prisoner of this place now, just like everyone else. The only way out is to find your true reflection." "My what?" The woman pointed to one of the mirrors. In the reflection, Alexander saw himself, but this time he looked different. His face was distorted. His eyes glowed with a dim red light. Suddenly, this reflection began to bang on the glass, as if trying to get out. "If it gets out, you'll take its place," the woman said. The corridor was filled with the sound of footsteps. The reflections in the mirrors began to move, as if preparing to break through to the real world. Alexander, gripped by panic, watched as his reflection from the mirror smashed into the glass. Trying to get out, the noise of footsteps around him intensified, and he felt time slipping away. Find his true reflection? How? What does that mean? He shouted, turning to the woman in white. She looked at him with empty eyes, but her voice sounded from somewhere far away. You must remember who you are. Only the truth opens doors. At that moment, the light in the corridor began to fade, and one by one the mirrors went out, plunging the space into darkness. Only one mirror continued to glow with a faint, ominous light. Alexander realized he had to go that way. The corridor was endless. Each step he took was followed by a cold whisper, as if the walls were talking to him. As he approached the glowing mirror, it again showed his distorted reflection, which was now smiling a wide, unnatural smile. You can't escape, the reflection said without moving its lips. Everything you've done, everything you've run from, has brought you here. Suddenly the mirror cracked, and a black liquid like smoke began to pour out of it, taking the shape of a human figure. The creature stretched out over Alexander. Its eyes were bottomless cavities. You were looking for a way out, but all you found was yourself, it whispered. Alexander stepped back, barely holding back a scream, but the woman's voice sounded in his head again. Don't be afraid. Look in the other mirror. He looked around and noticed a single mirror hanging separately from the others. It was broken, but there was no distortion inside it, just himself, but with an expression of pain and fear. This is the real you, the voice said. Accept it. The creature from the darkness began to approach, its hands reaching for Alexander, burning him cold. He had only a moment to choose. Gathering all his courage, he stepped toward the broken mirror and touched its surface. The mirror shattered into tiny shards and his consciousness was swallowed up by the light. Upon waking up, Alexander found himself lying on the floor of his hotel room. Everything was as if nothing had happened. The closet was closed. The mirror hung straight. The light was on. But when he stood up, he saw an inscription scrawled on the glass of the mirror as if written with a finger. You have found yourself, but the price has not yet been paid. A light whisper enveloped the room, and the door behind him opened slowly, inviting him out. Alexander walked to the open door, behind which he was greeted by an eerie silence. The corridor, which had been dark and empty before, was now filled with whispers. The sounds were not like words, but there was something frighteningly familiar about them. His footsteps echoed throughout the space. The air felt heavy and the walls seemed closer than before. Alexander felt as if the corridor was breathing, living a life of its own. What is this place? He whispered to himself, but there was no answer. A note suddenly appeared on the floor in front of him, as if it had just been planted by someone invisible. It was written in a strange, almost childish handwriting. Your fee is waiting for you in room 13. She always waits. Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. Go back to that room? Everything inside him screamed that this was a mistake, but his feet carried him back on their own. By the time he reached the door with the worn 13 sign, it was already ajar. You've been waiting for this, came a whisper. You came for the truth, and the truth always comes with a price. The room had changed. It now resembled a strange museum of his life. The walls were hung with pictures he had never seen before. Each one had him in it as a little boy, as an adult, with loved ones. But something about these pictures was wrong. The faces of others were smudged or completely erased. There was a table in the center of the room, on which lay a massive framed mirror. It was covered in dust, but through it he could make out movement. Alexander moved closer and carefully wiped the glass. In the mirror, he saw himself, but not the real one. He looked haggard there, his face scarred and his eyes deeply tired. Are you me? He muttered, realizing he was talking to himself. I am you, as you might have become. The reflection said, you were always running away, from problems, from people, from the truth. This room is payment for your mistakes. You're looking at what could have been if you had accepted them sooner. Alexander lowered his head. Everything, from what he ran away, torn relationship, unresolved conflict, lost chances, everything is now standing in front of him. What do I do? How to fix it all? Asked him. Zirkulos or Silo. A voice sounded like echo. You must leave a part of yourself here. Either you stay forever, or you come out different. Choose. Alexander realized that it is not just words. He would have to leave his regrets, his fears, and some of his pain in this room. But would he really be able to get rid of it? He took a deep breath and touched the mirror. His fingers felt the coldness of the glass and then a searing pain, as if the mirror was ripping something out of his soul. Waking up, Alexander found himself standing on the street again, in front of the hotel. It looked locked and abandoned, as if no one had lived in it for years. He held the same locket in his hands, but now it had a new engraved word on it: freedom. He left, knowing that he had become a different person, but behind him, Hotel 13 was still waiting for its new guests. Alexander thought it was all over, leaving Hotel 13 behind. He went about his normal life, but the memory of the mirror, the words of his reflection, and the strange hotel did not leave him. A few weeks later, going on another business trip, he again felt that oppressive feeling that someone was watching him. At the train station, in the crowd of people, he noticed a familiar figure. It was the conductor he had seen in the mirror that night. At first, he thought it was a figment of his imagination, but when the man raised his hand and beckoned him with a gesture, Alexander realized that the story was not over. This time he found himself in another city, distant and unfamiliar. His route took him through a small village where he was to spend the night. The inn he found looked normal, a cozy building with a sign that read Cozy Corner. But as soon as he stepped inside, his heart sank. The receptionist was a woman in white with blank eyes. She smiled, and her voice echoed in his memory. "Welcome, Alexander. Your room is ready. Room 13. "No," he whispered, backing away. "I'm not going in there." But the woman just silently handed him the key. The walls of the hotel began to darken slowly, and the light of the bulbs began to flicker. He realized there was nowhere to run. When he opened the door, the same room as the first time was in front of him, but it was different now. The mirror was gone. Instead, there was a painting on the wall of a train hurtling through the void. On the bed was a diary. Opening it, Alexander saw the entries of the previous guests. "We all thought it was possible to leave," one of the entries said, "but the price always finds you." Suddenly the diary was ripped from his hands and unfolded onto a blank page. The words began to flow right before his eyes. "You thought this was the end, but every guest has his time, and yours hasn't come yet." At that moment, the door behind his back slammed shut and the room was filled with the same rumble he had heard in the mirrored hallway. He turned around and saw that the painting on the walls had come to life. The train was moving forward, and in its windows flashed faces, suffering, screaming, begging for help. Among them Alexander saw himself. "No!" he shouted, rushing to the door, but it would not open. A woman's voice came from behind him. "You can't run away from what's inside you." At the last moment he felt something cold grab his shoulder, and everything went dark. Waking up, Alexander was back at the train station. A crowd of people were rushing about. Everything looked normal, but there was no longer a locket in his hand. In its place was a key with the number 13 on it. He realized the hotel had become a part of him, and now he was its new keeper. Alexander looked at the key with the number 13 for a long time. He realized that this object was more than just a thing. Its weight was palpable, as if the key contained the weight of his fears, his mistakes, and now his destiny. With the key in his hand, Alexander felt himself being pulled backwards. Every movement, every step seemed to bring him closer to the inevitable. He realized that it was pointless to resist. Several hours passed until he found himself on the very street where the North Hotel stood. It looked the same, old, dilapidated, with broken windows and peeling paint. Only now the sign under the name of the building read, "Welcome back." Once inside, Alexander noticed that the hotel had changed. There was no receptionist or guest book in place of the front desk. Instead, there was another key with the number 14 on the counter. Behind the counter, the very same conductor appeared. His eyes were glowing and a sinister smirk froze on his face. "Did you think this was the end?" he said. "No, this is just the beginning." "What am I supposed to do now?" Alexander asked, barely containing the tremor in his voice. "You are a keeper," the conductor answered. "Your task is to receive new guests. Each of them brings a part of themselves, and you ensure that the cycle is not broken." Alexander climbed the familiar stairs, but now every step echoed heavily, as if the hotel itself were watching him. The woman in white, the one who had warned him once before, was waiting for him at the door with number 14. "Why me?" he asked quietly. "Because you made a choice," she replied. "You accepted the mirror and your truth. You are now part of this inn, and your destiny is not to break its chain." The door to room 14 opened by itself. There was no furniture inside. only a multitude of mirrors in which people were reflected. Their faces were sad, but each of them looked directly at Alexander, as if asking for help. "They're all waiting to come out," the woman whispered, "and now it's your concern." Alexander realized that he could no longer leave this place. His role was to welcome new guests, observe their journeys, and make sure the cycle continued. Hotel 13 became part of his essence, and he became part of it. That night at the train station, another traveler, tired and lost, noticed the dim light of the north sign. He didn't know what awaited him inside, but Alexander was ready to meet him. Hotel number 13 continued its work, accepting new guests, and its keeper remained on the threshold, watching their fates.